Hi there! Welcome to my video on tips to help you improve at Legends of Runeterra. I've reached Master in both seasons of Runeterra so far with a limited card game background, only having played Hearthstone and a little bit of Gwent before. And throughout both seasons I've picked up some tricks to help me climb, and wanted to share them with you. So, straight into the tips. Tip 1. Mulliganing. Mulliganing well makes such a big difference. In my opinion, it's one of the most important moments of the game. I can't provide any overall tips for mulligans as it varies from deck to deck, and I do my best to explain them in my deck guides. All I can say is you need to be aware of your win condition against your opponent's deck and mulligan for that. If it's aggro, you may want to look for healing and blockers. If you're against control, you need to look for your most important units so you can play them on curve and outpace your opponent. Tip 2. Playing into removal. Always think what removal your opponent can have and avoid playing into it to give your opponent good value. If you can get them to spend more mana or cards killing your unit than you paid for it, that's the ideal situation. In the example here, my opponent has a keg, and I could either play Deadbloom Wanderer or Jowl Hunters. The removal my opponent could have is Culling Strike, Noxian Fervor, and Make It Rain. Both Culling Strike and Noxian Fervor are okay as it would be an equal mana trade, but Make It Rain would be devastating, killing 2 of my units for 2 mana and only 1 card and 1 keg. Because of this, I choose to attack the keg first, so I can then play Deadbloom. He uses Make It Rain, and because I chose to bait out his spell first, I still have my Deadbloom. Tip number 3. Hand reading. Reading your opponent's hand is a very hard skill, but can be so important. I've talked about playing around removal, and it's fairly easy to just play around every spell your opponent might have. But the real skill is spotting when you can play into the spell, knowing your opponent doesn't have it. In the example here, my opponent is playing an Endure deck. He chooses to play Avarosan Sentry and does not Vile Feast Teemo. This suggests he does not have a Vile Feast in his hand. Going into the next round, he plays Omen Hawk, which suggests he doesn't have a Callista in his hand. If you build up and keep note of this information, over the course of a game, you can get a very good idea what is and isn't in your opponent's hand. If you wanted to try hard this, you could even write down information and note card positions, but that's far too try hard for me. Tip number 4. When to block. When blocking, you always want to get good value from your blocks. The way I weigh it up is trading a 2-1 into a 3-2 is good value, as you're trading 3 total stats for 5. However, when blocking, you need to be wary of your opponent's combat tricks. In the example here, I block with both the Devourer and Nautilus, as my opponent would need at least 2 more cards to kill them. However, I do not block with Maokai, even though it's good value, as my opponent may have Fury of the North, and I have no combat tricks to protect him. Related to this, thinking about how your opponent will block is a great way of deciding which units to attack with. Always try to take into account their combat tricks. In this example, I attack with both my 5-1 and 4-4. This is because if I was my opponent, the best blocks would be blocking my 4-4 with his Sedge, and I have 2 Fury of the Norths, which will be any card he can play for 5 mana. He actually blocks both units, which is surprising, as his Puffcat Peddler is a crucial card for his deck, but predictably blocks with Sedge, and using my 2 Furies, I get a really good trade. Tip number 5. Open attacking versus developing. Knowing when to open attack or develop your board first is important. What it comes down to is what units can you play and what can your opponent play. Would you both play in a unit make your attack stronger? Then you'd want to develop first. The other thing to consider is what speed cards does your opponent's deck run. If it is a lot of fast and burst spells, they could use them all even if you open attack, and therefore you should develop first. In this example, I'm against a Control Swain deck, which runs a lot of fast removal spells. Therefore, I always develop into my attacks as they will play all their spells, whether I attack with my first or last action. In this clip, it's the opposite situation, where most of my hand is fast and burst speed spells. Therefore I open attack as I cannot develop my board anymore. But even if I had a weak unit such as Omen Hawk or Avarosan Sentry, I would still open attack as my opponent would likely play a stronger unit, making my attack worse. Tip number 6. Passing. Knowing when to pass will help you improve so much at this game. If you pass and your opponent plays something, it allows you to be reactive, which is much better than being proactive. The only thing is your opponent may pass 2, wasting your mana and your turn. The question I always ask myself before I pass is how bad is it if my opponent passes back? Who loses more mana? and who has the slower deck. If you have the slower deck, you want to get to 10 mana faster, so skipping around is okay. In the example here, I choose to open attack instead of passing, which was a mistake. I forgot my opponent played Lore of the Depths, and therefore could play Abyssal Eye. If I passed, I could play and attack with Jowl Hunters, killing his unit. Instead, I have to use Grass to kill his Abyssal Eye before he gets deep, which costs 5 mana instead of 3 from Jowl Hunters, and Jowl Hunters would create a sea monster in hand. Tip number 7. Be patient with lethal if you are low on Nexus HP or if your opponent has healing. This is so important. Always remember your opponent can react to what you might do. If you have lethal, make sure your opponent burns his mana before you go for it. If you use all your cards and your opponent lives on 1 health, it may cost you the game. I struggled to find a decent example for this, as it's a mistake rarely made higher up the ladder, and it's debatable whether this was actually a misplay. But in this example, my opponent has stolen my Atrocity and Devourer and uses them to try and kill me. But I have Healing and Survive, meaning he loses his blocker and I can attack on an open board next turn. My opponent was desperate and in a very bad position, but what he should have tried was to see if I'd burn more mana and then gone for the play, or used it when he had absolutely no choice in the following round. Tip number 8. Learn the meta deck lists and bring them up if needed. Mobalytics is definitely the most popular deck site, worth checking out if you want to play something new. I find on ladder, the majority of people copy these exact lists and just run them. So if you have the list on your phone or second monitor, you can work out exactly what removal to play around and what units they might play. This helps tremendously with the tips I've outlined above, and you'll see a noticeable improvement if you start doing this. I've put the Mobalytics site in the description below. So that's all the tips I have for you today. Hopefully you picked up something new and this guide helps you out. If it did, please leave a like and subscribe. Thanks for watching and have a good day.